How y'all doing today? Welcome back. Once again, as I already told y'all before in a previous video about North Carolina being the fight of the three conferences between the SEC, the Big 10, and the Big 12, right? Each one of them would like to have North Carolina. To be honest with you, North Carolina is like Notre Dame. Basically, they have a national presence, even though they're not independent, that they're inside the ACC conference. They have that same type of effect, just as Notre Dame does, but they're like the basketball of the Notre Dame football side of things. So with that being said, let's look at where potential teams may land if, ESPN decides to move pieces around or players or teams around within the ACC conference. For an example, we already know Florida State and Clemson would like to take their talents to either independent or another conference because they just cannot stand par inside of the current deal that they're in now, looking at the college landscape, which is serving the best interests of their team and the future of their institute in sports. So no harm there, no pun intended. That's understandable. Now you look at the other schools. North Carolina also is looking at, okay, well, the grass is greener on the other side, but then you weigh in your factors. Is it all about money? Is it just about money? Because if it is, yes, the grass is greener on the other side. But if it's not, then you're looking at, okay, if we stay put here, then we're going to be in a conference that is going into a negative spiral if two major football brands leave. So they have to decide, okay, if we stay in the ACC while Florida State and Clemson leave, then where do the ACC stand as a conference as a whole, as a perception, as to other teams that may come in and fill the void of those two? And to be honest with you, they are looking at it in that aspect. Okay, yes, we can get all this money if we stay, but how will things progress as a conference as a whole? So that's a decision that North Carolina is faced with right now. Do they leave for greener pastures on the other side, or do they stay put? Well, we know that they have a landing spot regardless. It's like automatic. They'll be able to get into any of the other conferences. Now, the question is, there's a barrier for the members that are in the ACC right now, which right now that is trying to be broke with the two lawsuits with Clemson and Florida State. Once that barrier is broke, then that will open up the floodgates for other members to venture off into the prospective conferences. Now, of course, the TV partners do play a role in this, because when they start moving pieces around, it's more of like, okay, who's going where? Well, we know that if you look at Florida State and Clemson, that is the Florida and the South Carolina market. Do the SEC already have that? Yes, they do. Does the Big 10 have that market? No. So the demand would go towards the Big 10, more or less than the SEC. So what markets can the SEC venture into? Well, we know that North Carolina is a new market for them, and that would sit well with the game clocks in South Carolina, and we've already saw that matchup before. So that kind of reveals the dynamics of those two schools when they play each other. So we could clearly see North Carolina on the verge of going to the SEC, and the Clemson and the Florida State going to the Big 10. It doesn't matter what is going on right now as a process in relation to the lawsuit that's going on and how they're trying to exit, because at the end of the day, it's about business. And yes, they do have a landing spot in the Big 10. Now, the SEC, or should I say, back then, it was stated Now, these are not facts, but it's a possibility that a long time ago, when Texas and Oklahoma was going to the SEC also talked to other schools in the Big 12, and Kansas being one of them. So when that door was closed, and now that we have realignment talk and more potential moving parts that may end up that the SEC having of viewing the ACC, well, another rumor mill just came out that potentially Kansas would like to go to the SEC, or the SEC will consider adding Kansas. Well, if you look at it this way, the SEC has 16 teams, which is on par with the Big 12. If I see the SEC looking at it as, okay, we're good with football, we have all the football schools we need, and we need to look into basketball, which I can see that being a strategy for Mr. Sankey. So yes, you would see him start to try to pull basketball dominant schools like North Carolina, and then yes, Kansas wouldn't be too far out. Well, if that's the case, what about UConn? So with that being said, there is a potential that they could potentially look at Kansas, but it's more of like they don't really need Kansas, to be honest with you, because if you look at this past year, the tournament, the SEC had the same amount of teams in the tournament as the Big 12, if not a little more, or should I say they went a little further than the Big 12 this last year. So they're, even though they're not the best college basketball conference, they're not doing bad at advancing. And yes, this is a money grab. Yes, these conferences are only looking out for their best interests. So do not be manipulated or misled that they are having a best interest for the college sports as a whole. That's just malarkey. So if North Carolina ends up in the SEC, what other school would there be from the from ACC? They may not even want to get any other schools besides North Carolina, and they may end up trying to get Kansas, but I doubt that, just because they don't need Kansas. So we don't know how desperate the SEC may try to look at this approach as something that they would like to do or tackle, but they do have strong teams currently in basketball, even though they're not the best. And I don't see any other schools in basketball, right, aside from North Carolina. If they looking at it from a basketball perspective, I don't see no other teams in the SEC besides North Carolina, because if you look at the history of the realignment with the SEC, less is more. Quality and less is more. So they're not going to just add 4 teams or nothing like that. They may get usually 2 teams, 1 to 2 teams, period. Now, what would that look like for the ACC? Well, if North Carolina leave with Clemson and Florida State, then what options will there be for the Big 12? Well, there's 4 schools, potentially 5 schools that always come up, and these schools can be rotated. And we know that in tier 1 would be Louisville as a top tier for the Big 12, as well as Miami. And the reason why Miami is important, because it brings back it's like the opposite of BYU. Miami is like the BYU, and that would be a good fit for both Miami as an institute, and they're in the rebuilding process. What other better place to do that, as well as it'll work for the Big 12. And I believe that it fits well because yes, it is in one of the largest markets, I think the 9th, if I'm not mistaken, Miami, or top 30, one of the two. markets, and that's just how right now the Big 12 is. They have some of the top markets, TV markets in their conference right now. So Miami seems to be a great fit for the Big 12 regardless. Most of these other conferences, like the Big 10, is already overcrowded. The revenue split is going to decrease with the exception of the playoffs. Maybe that bought them another room to expand with 2 more teams or so beyond 18, but it looks like 20 is the number. So that would leave the Big 10 with 2 slots, the SEC with 4, and the Big 12 with 4. The question is, who would those be? And the SEC may not even go for 4 all at once. They may do 2 and 2. But at the end of the day, remember this for the moving parts or the moving institutes. When you move to another conference, understand if you're going to the SEC or if you're going to a Big 10 or the Big 12, what are your odds of winning when you go there? What are your odds of being relevant when you go there? Are you just going there to be a pushpin for these conferences and collect your check? Well, we know that can end up being a bad thing, because especially if it's a potential of the schools like the Vanderbilts and the Vanderbilts and the other schools that are not relevant in these conferences potentially being weeded out. But remember, the more the teams, everyone can't win. So you're going to have these schools that are rotating at the bottom. So I guess they would say it would be worth it, for the time being. But at the end of the day, you will make your program. If you are a top program in ACC, you're definitely not going to be one when you move over, because you have to understand the dynamics of the founders of these conferences, the institutes, and the way things are structured, and the way it's structured for TV and things like that. It's just going to be difficult to win consistently in a competitive conference on that level. So with that being said, that's food for thought for the institutes moving to these other conferences. Now, Miami would be a good fit along with Louisville as tier 1 choices and options, and it will be a mutual benefit for both institute and conference. And then the other 2 teams, and I like to say, well, if you can't get North Carolina, NC State, that would be splitting the market. I would rather go with Virginia. If you can get the Virginia market, go for those 2 schools. If not, then you would have to cut it short with Virginia Tech and NC State. But don't forget about Pitt. Pitt is also a school as the fifth option to look at, and potentially being on the 2nd tier level with either Virginia Tech and Pitt, or NC State and Pitt, or Virginia Tech and NC State. So there you have it. We already know that the SEC probably would only get North Carolina, and they'll probably try to get Kansas State, but they don't need them. And I don't see how that would do well in football. We already know Kansas football has not won anything since forever, so that would be a straight dry out. If they're just looking at it for a basketball perspective, what are their odds of doing well in basketball in the SEC? Who knows? But for the most part, the Big 12, the SEC is not going to go more than 2 schools from the ACC, period. Likewise, as I mentioned before, the Big 10 wants Notre Dame, and they would like to have Florida State and Clemson. Once again, thank you all for watching. Till next time, a summary rundown on what's going on with college sports realignment. Thank you all, and don't forget to go to size-11.com and get your merch. get your clothing, get your accessories. It's all types of stuff on that website. That's www.size-11.com. Peace.